Hello existentialists, welcome to Heidegger Round 3. This time on time, temporality, philosophy, and worldview. What we are going to do this time is read Heidegger's 1924 Marburg essay, The Concept of Time, often considered as by Gadamer the nutshell form of being in time, and more conducive to a survey course like this than trying to tackle the whole work, as well as looking briefly to the transition from Division 1 to Division 2, Dasein and Temporality, and some of the core concepts in Division 2 of being in time. This will set up, for our purposes, a brief look into two later essays by Heidegger, What is Philosophy and The Age of the World Picture. So if you've been falling a bit behind on your readings, this is one not to miss. The 1924 lecture, The Concept of Time, is for us Heidegger Round 3, but it's one of the most helpful pieces he wrote, and if you get this one, you're well on your way to getting Heidegger. As the editor, William McNeill, notes, this lecture presents in a concise yet developed form many of the analyses which were subsequently expanded and incorporated into Heidegger's major work, Being in Time. In short order, the lecture provides a helpful overview in the form of various theses of most of the major themes that end up determining the overall structure of the work. Missing from the lecture, on account of its brevity and the stage of development of Heidegger's project at the time, is a more in-depth account of the meaning of being in general, as well as disclosedness, truth, and the phenomena of conscience. Nevertheless, Hans-Georg Gadamer has called this lecture the Urform of Heidegger's magnum opus. Specifically, it goes much more into detail on JEWEILIKKEIT, translated as specificity, but also meaning duration or whiling, and as a disclosure through temporality of Daseins being. The editor comments that perhaps the uncanniness of anxiety in being in time has been overrated in its philosophical importance compared to JEWEILIKKEIT, which is mostly under erasure in Division 1 and being in time and discussed only as Gemeinigkeit, mindness, before making an indirect return into Division 2 in the theme of temporality or temporal duration, the dilation of the now. The main topic of this essay or speech is what is time? And during and subsequent to this lecture, Heidegger delivered two major full-length lecture courses on the philosophy of time. Much earlier, he had written The Concept of Time in the Science of History. In short, Heidegger's obsession with time and history and his desire to make original contributions to this field of investigation go very far back. He begins this lecture with a simple question. The following reflections are concerned with time. What is time? The traditional philosophical response to this question is to subordinate time to eternity, to say time is a sequence of now points and what passes, whereas what truly is permanent in its presence and eternal, and thus beyond time. And so we get the naive metaphysical opposition of time and the timeless. Already practicing his signature method of deconstruction in a certain way, Heidegger begins from the traditional understanding of time as eternity and notes, if time finds its meaning in eternity, then it must be understood starting from eternity. The point of departure and path of this inquiry are thereby indicated in advance, from eternity to time. Unfortunately, this way of proceeding is only at our disposal if we are acquainted with eternity and adequately understand it. And alas, if we are honest with ourselves here, we don't philosophically know whether eternity is the, quote, empty state of perpetual being, the always is of Greek philosophy, the I, nor do we know if God is eternity, i.e. the being that is perpetual being. If we are doing theology, we very well may begin with these starting points as presuppositions, approaching time in terms of being itself, or in terms of God as the one immortal eternal being. In other words, if we start in eternity and want to understand time on its basis, we must begin with being or God. But for Heidegger, such a starting point would be faith and not philosophy. Where exactly does philosophy distinguish itself from theology? In the first instance, philosophy does not know and can never be relieved of this perplexity. And if the movement from eternity to time is the correct starting point and method of approach, then the theologian, in fact, becomes the legitimate expert on time. And here Heidegger speaks a little tongue-in-cheek. If recollection serves us correctly, theology is concerned with time in several respects. 1. Theology is concerned with human existence as being before God, and the specific form of lived time or temporality of human existence or Dasein is only understood as related to eternity. For it is God who grounds eternity, and God is not grounded through our faith, because God, eternity, being in time, exist independently. Next, Christian theology in particular is concerned with a very specific event in the temporal historical order of things, i.e. the birth, life, death, and resurrection of God as man. At a particular time, according to Christian theology, God incarnated holy and without remainder as man, that is, in a moment of time, or kairos. And this moment was, with respect to the whole of time and history, the time when time was fulfilled. All well and good for the theological approach to time. Now here Heidegger announces that philosophical thinking itself should not be a theism or theology, and announces the atheism of thinking, but here in a neutral rather than negative sense, stating simply, the philosopher does not believe, rather the philosopher thinks. If the philosopher asks about time, then he is resolved to understand time in terms of time, or in terms of the eternal being, which looks like eternity in the Christian sense, but proves to be a mere derivative of being temporal. Unstated here, but Heidegger claims to have discovered in ancient Greek philosophy the fact that the eternal is always understood in ancient thought as a modification of nature and its temporality. It's what always is within flux and becoming. This is a very different starting point for the philosophy of time than Abrahamic theology. According to Heidegger, for philosophy, time must be understood from out of itself or from out of eternal being, but in that case, eternity must be encountered as it appears to us, not in terms of an a priori philosophical or theological conception of it. It takes for granted a starting point in God or being. And accordingly, the following considerations are not theological. This does not mean that Heidegger is resistant to theological interpretation. For notice that the use of the term philosophy here is more limited, a limitation of the field of investigation based on knowledge and thinking, what we can know, without presupposing faith. Heidegger also avers at this point that the lecture will not even provide a philosophical interpretation. But here he uses the term philosophical in the specific sense of ontotheology or metaphysics. That is, he's not going to present a universally valid systematic determination of the essence of time. Rather, he wants to investigate what he calls here the pre-science of time. That is, to think more deeply about temporality as an existential experience of Dasein. The move from pre-science to science here is very similar to the move from Dasein's pre-understanding of being to a possible ontology in being and time. What, in the context of this lecture, is a pre-science? Science, theology, and philosophy as metaphysics all have their determinate objects. They're to be thought, explained, and interpreted. But if we are going to approach time from the point of view of Dasein's experience of temporality, this is not philosophy strictly, nor science, nor theology. Heidegger will later call it hermeneutic phenomenology. Such pre-science is necessary to delimit phenomena prior to theorizing about them. In the case of time especially, we must describe the phenomena to be interpreted. Should not from the get-go apply a theory. Philosophy in the more limited sense and science both take place in the concept. But pre-science clarifies the phenomena to which concepts refer. This quest for a pre-science on Heidegger's part bespeaks his quest for an original starting point. We will not understand time except through the phenomenology of time. And this is indeed inordinately ambitious, for what if the very concepts with which we tend to think about time, in fact, only inadequately apply to the phenomena? And what if there are other conceptual frameworks which have been overlooked in the history of science, theology, and philosophy? A bit like in skepticism, Heidegger avers that the possibility of a pre-science entails that every researcher achieve clarity concerning what he understands and what he does not understand. A pre-science lets us know when a particular piece of research is directly concerned with its matter, its Sache selbst, the matter at hand, or when it feeds on a traditional and hackneyed verbal knowledge of it. Heidegger's example here is, if we achieve clarity about what a clock is, that is an instrument which measures time, within a particular metric and according to a particular perspective, then this kind of apprehension can serve to situate the knowledge of time granted by physics, and also gives time itself an opportunity to show itself within and yet independently of the theoretical findings of the physics of time. Heidegger next turns to three ways in which we speak about time. There is the time in everydayness, there is natural time, and then there is world time. Philosophy has indeed often sought to connect these three times, to understand how time as it is lived relates to, say, the time of the earth, or the time of the cosmos. And modern physics, recently in Heidegger's own day, has formulated these three types of time in their interrelation with enormous scientific clarity and certainty, such as in Einstein's theory of special and general relativity. What relativity measures is nature within a system of space-time relations. And in a sense, it accounts for the time-place space of the earth and of everyday life in a cosmic perspective. It proposes 1. That space is nothing in itself. There is no absolute space, for space exists merely in the way of bodies and energies contained in space. And Heidegger notes this was an old proposition of Aristotle's. And 2, it asserts that time as well is nothing. It persists merely as a consequence of the events taking place in time. There is no absolute time and no absolute simultaneity either. These principles of special and general relativity may seem destructive. For Heidegger, they demonstrate the, quote, invariability with respect to arbitrary transformations of those equations which describe natural processes. Relativity demonstrates that time is that in which events take place. And so, in a way, relativity's account of world time and the time of nature refers back to time in everydayness, and time in everydayness refers back to natural and to world time. And yet, as visionary and grandiose as Einstein's understanding of time is, and as definitively as it situates the now time of the Earth and the moment of lived time in cosmic perspective, it does not in the end constitute a hermeneutic phenomenology of temporality. To understand time in this sense as temporality, we in fact have to go back through the philosophical tradition, beginning with Aristotle. For Aristotle, time is not movement, kinesis, but it has to do with movement, and it is always encountered amidst entities that are changeable, where change is a process unfolding in time. In this way, Aristotle tends to reduce time to the before and after and the now point. That is past, present, and future. What is lacking in the Aristotelian investigation is an attention to the peculiar being of time. And the physicist, even Einstein, approaches time much like Aristotle, in terms of the how long and the when. But what do we learn from the clock about time? In a way, the clock is where the before, the after, and the now intersect and are visible as true theories about the nature of time. But time itself, Heidegger reveres, not something in which a now point may be arbitrarily fixed, such that with respect to two different time points, one is earlier and the other later. As now, any now point of time is the possible earlier of a later, and as later, it is the later of an earlier. This time, clock time, is thoroughly uniform and homogeneous and measurable. And this is very much unlike the time that we experience. If we approach a time-space event with a clock, then the clock makes the event explicit, but more with respect to its unfolding in the now than with respect to the how much of its duration. In fact, time is experienced less as a now point and more as a duration, or whiling, JEWEILIKKEIT, of events in time. Aristotle and modern physics both tend to fix time, the former pre-theoretically by and large, and the latter within a coordinate geometry. Yes, modern physics accounts for duration in an abstract sense, not for the lived experience of duration, or whiling. The questions are becoming quite difficult now. Initially asking what is time and looking from Einstein back to Aristotle, Heidegger now asks what is the now? Is the now at my disposal? Am I the now? Is every other person the now? If so, then time would indeed be I myself, and every other person would be time, and in our being with one another, we would be time. Everyone and no one, time. Am I the now, or only the one who is saying this, with or without any explicit clock? When we ask what is the now, we ask something more, simply the determination of clock time, or the delimitation of our now within cosmic time. We ask about the now itself, and thus our very being. Heidegger notes here that human existence has always assumed the natural clock of the alternation of night and day. Night and day are basic existential dimensions within which time is experienced for us. But this simple fact does not clarify how day and night are natural times that determine human temporal experience. For it is always a being, in this case the human being, who experiences time. Day and night never experience time. How is our very being as temporal, as whiling duration and the experience of this duration related to the being of time? Do I dispose over the being of time? Do I also mean myself in the now? Am I myself the now and my existence time? Or is it ultimately time itself that procures for itself the clock in us? Very deep and difficult questions indeed. They already point towards what Heidegger's answer will be. Our experience as Dasein is an experience of temporality. We are beings of and in time. In fact, our very being is this temporal unfolding. These propositions are nothing new in philosophy. And here Heidegger turns to St. Augustine, who is likely the greatest philosopher of time before Heidegger. Heidegger notes that it's very common in philosophical studies of time to revolve in the orbit of Augustine. For facing the paradoxes of time versus temporal experience, he pursued the question so far as to ask whether spirit itself is time. In his own words, "In you, my spirit, I measure times. You I measure as I measure time." The transitory things encountered bring you into a disposition which remains while those things disappear. The disposition I measure in present existence, not the things that pass by, in order that this disposition first arises. My very finding myself disposed, I repeat, is what I measure when I measure time. In translating for himself this famous passage from Augustine, Heidegger translates the Latin anima by the German Geist, spirit. He might have also said soul. And he translates the term affectio, disposition being affected towards something, by Befindlichkeit, disposition or finding oneself disposed. What Augustine's meditation reveals is that time is never an abstracted something, a mere medium of before, after, and now, rather something that we experience as living beings, beings of soul or spirit, who measure or experience time always from the perspective of their being. It is interesting that it is from Augustine's suggestion that Heidegger derives his focus on Dasein's temporal duration. Now, noting by Dasein, we mean that entity in its being which we know as human life, this entity in the specificity or Weiling, JEWEILIKKEIT of its being, the entity that we each ourselves are, which each of us finds in the fundamental assertion, I am. In its specificity, this entity is as mind. And Heidegger is careful here not to reduce Dasein to acts of consciousness or mental processes that exist in time. This would be to entirely avoid the experience of lived temporality. Yes, it's true that in an everyday sense, Dasein is in time, but Dasein is also what Heidegger calls temporalizing. We are in time, and yet we temporalize this very being in time and have an effect on it. When we fail to do so, time simply passes, but when we do so, we enter into the realm of what Heidegger now calls authentic temporality, which in being in time he will call temporal historicity. In 1924, this is simply spirit or soul, words which, as you'll remember, get suspended at the outset of being in time. Heidegger's next move in attempting to develop this crucible for his hermeneutic phenomenology of time is to analyze our very being in the world, our existence as Dasein, as a being temporal. And he furthermore subdivides this being temporal of Dasein into 8 fundamental moments. Yes, Dasein is embedded in natural and cosmic time and gains its orientation thereby, but more fundamentally, quote, being temporal, correctly understood, is the fundamental assertion of Dasein with respect to its being. In order to explain this provocative claim, Heidegger provides 8 theses regarding Dasein, which of course we'll recognize as structuring being in time. First, Dasein is being in the world, that is, dealing in the world, tarrying alongside it, contemplating, interrogating, and determining it. Dasein as being in the world is care or concern within all its worldly dealings. 2, as this being in the world, Dasein is, together with this, being with others, having the same world there with the others, and encountering one another, being with one another in the manner of being for one another. 3, being with one another in the world, having this world as being with one another, is essentially, in the case of human Dasein, determined by speaking, or logos, discourse. This statement may seem like it's coming out of the blue, but it also goes back to Aristotle. Look at human beings in the world and notice they're constantly self-interpreting, whether to themselves or to others. And this self-interpreting in the broadest sense is what Heidegger is calling speaking, or logos. Such speaking or logos may also occur in silence or solitude, and could also be called thinking. This third proposition is indeed true, for it is never just events that take place, but rather human existing is always a speaking and self-interpreting that positively contributes to what happens. In speaking with one another, in what one thus spreads around in speaking, there lies the specific self-interpretation of the present, which maintains itself in this dialogue. In Heidegger's analysis of Dasein as being temporal, he doesn't need the more robust form of the thesis here. Dasein's thinking is always determining its time and those events which unfold in it. This is because at the time of delivering this lecture, he is speaking to his audience, providing a specific self-interpretation of the present. Remember, he asked, "Am I the now?" And maintaining himself along with his auditors in a kind of dialogue, even if this dialogue is ultimately rooted in the monologue from which he wrote the essay. The fourth structure of Dasein as being temporal is that Dasein has a specific I am. It is always mein Dasein, in each case mine, or as the Latin saying goes, I am what concerns me. Fifth, since we are always already with others and others are with others, no one is himself in everydayness. What someone is and how he is, in a public forum, say like the lecture hall, is nobody, no one, and yet everyone with one another. This nobody by whom we ourselves are lived in everydayness is the one, das Man, and this one levels down the possibilities of the I am. Of course, in this fifth moment is tempted to retreat into its solitude, hoping there, of course, in some way to find a world without others. Yet, existentially, others are always already along with this self, even when it is alone. Sixth, Dasein is a being to whom its being matters. It is essentially involved in concernful dealings. Care for Dasein has in each specific case placed being in care. That is, the being of beings insofar as they are familiar and understood, and are thus possible objects of the care of Dasein. 7. In everydayness, Dasein little reflects on its I, its ego, or self, but rather always finds itself disposed alongside itself, Befindlichkeit. And lastly, Dasein cannot be proven externally. You might think that the problem of the proof of the external world is hard. Much more difficult is the problem of proving that Dasein exists. Indeed, the primary relation to Dasein is not that of contemplation of something, but rather being Dasein, being it. And while self-interpretation is fairly constant, it is nevertheless only one mode of Dasein's being. Indeed, a mode that tends to be overseen by the one, das Man, and by tradition. Heidegger's overarching point here is that Dasein is accessible to itself only through interpretation. And so only Dasein is in this singular position to understand the being of its temporality, and perhaps even of time itself. This grappling with the being of our temporality through interpretation is only possible, however, when Dasein overcomes its everydayness and inauthenticity. That is, when it ceases to be merely dragged along in its temporal while. Being in time will eventually call fallenness. Only through a transition to a different mode of temporalization will Dasein attain the possibility of seizing itself in authenticity, in the authenticity of its being, as a temporal being. Now, in this existentialism course, we've thrown around the term authenticity a lot and not yet really discussed what its fundamental meaning is as it's introduced into existential discourse in Heidegger. The term he uses is Eigentlichkeit, which comes from eigen, meaning ownness or what is proper to oneself. Of course, if we translated Eigentlichkeit as propriety or the proper, this would lead to all kinds of moral misinterpretations. We should attempt to think the English terms authenticity and inauthenticity in terms of these German roots, as well as the Greek and Latin roots of this word, which mean genuine, original, principle, autos, self or acting on one's own authority, hentis or doing and being. Authenticity is thus connected to the English language of autonomy and even autochthony, to accomplish and achieve oneself. This long before it becomes leveled down as the authoritative or duly authorized, or the authentic or genuine article as opposed to the fake and the derivative. The history of the use of this term in English is even more complicated by the fact that it's associated with trustworthiness, a thing corresponding to facts and not being fictitious, and hence reliable, unadulterated. In the broadest ontological sense, the authentic merely means a being in its very being. And this broader perspective, in fact, goes back to the Greek and Latin roots, as opposed to modern English, where we are always attempting to distinguish between the genuine and the authentic, a distinction that does not accord with the etymology of this word according to the Oxford English Dictionary. We may have become used to, in this existentialism course, thinking of authenticity simply as some sort of modification of what we all acknowledge to be our thrown, fallen, mediocre, or inauthentic condition, and thus as a kind of moral ideal. But the term itself only means to become what you are, properly. According to Heidegger, this becoming what you are, or Eigentlichkeit, is what constitutes the most extreme possibility of your being. In fact, without this authenticity and your engagement, the 8 theses on Dasein that Heidegger has articulated would remain free-floating, as you might read and understand them without experiencing them as hermeneutic existential structures of your very being in the world. But here we come up against the great problematic that marks the transition from Division 1 to Division 2. How is Dasein to achieve its Eigentlichkeit, or most extreme possibility of being, given that Dasein is a finite being always involved in a particular temporal whiling and thrown by its very nature into time and history? Or as Heidegger frames it, how is this entity to be apprehended in its being before it has reached its end? Dasein is always a being in the making and an unfolding, And we don't know what the totality of Dasein entails, or whether or not the wholeness or totality of Dasein is even necessary for its authenticity. After all, as Heidegger puts it, I am still underway with my Dasein, i.e. my Dasein is a temporal process, always in the present, and always in relation to the future and the past. Dasein is still something that is not yet at an end. However, when it reaches the end, it precisely no longer is. That where death is not, I am, and where death is, I am not, is a thesis most extensively developed in the Epicurean school of ancient philosophy, and also picked up by Nietzsche in his Thus Spoke Zarathustra. This was not exactly how Plato conceived death in his Phaedo, and many philosophers have seen death as the gateway to the eternity of the soul. But for Heidegger, that presupposition constitutes an unwarranted importing of faith into philosophy, much like in the Abrahamic tradition. If we want to understand time as time and the temporality of Dasein, we must also treat death as death, that is, as the end of Dasein's being. This is not to weigh in on debates as to the form that Dasein might take after death in, say, an afterlife, but it is to say that those metaphysical speculations are in every instance nothing that I have experienced in this life as Dasein, as the Dasein that I am. Whatever death is from a metaphysical perspective, from a hermeneutic phenomenological perspective, it must be approached simply as the end of my being as Dasein. What is more, prior to this end, Dasein never authentically is what it can fully be. And if it is the totality of its being, that is every event that stretches between birth and death, then it no longer is. This is a structural problem in trying to determine the very being of Dasein. How can we know what it is when my Dasein is still underway and there is so much of it which is still outstanding? Furthermore, information on the Dasein of others who were with me and who have reached an end that is death is poor information. I never am that other Dasein, who may or may not have found itself some way in death. Rather, the end of my Dasein is, structurally speaking, always my death. And this death is not some point at which a sequence of events suddenly breaks off, but a possibility which we surmise in this and that, indeed the most extreme possibility. The possibility of Dasein's own impossibility, as Heidegger will formulate it in Being and Time. Death is for Dasein to be defined as the possibility of the impossibility of its being Dasein. And in relation to this being towards death, Dasein can seize and appropriate this possibility as something that stands before it. This is the first glimmer in Heidegger of our existential relation to death. So Heidegger's first pass at the very relation of death and time is this: death is only in our being towards the ownmost possibility of our own utter impossibility. As Heidegger puts it in the lecture, the self-interpretation of Dasein, which towers over every other statement of certainty and authenticity, is its interpretation with respect to its death, the indeterminate certainty of its ownmost possibility of being at an end. And Heidegger now asks, how does this concern our question of what time is, and especially the initial question of what Dasein is in time? To which Heidegger answers, Dasein as human life is primarily a being possible, the being of the possibility of its certain yet indeterminate past. Death is not just a possibility for Heidegger, but a certainty not to be outstripped. I already know that I must die, but I'm not thinking about it. And this holds regardless about beliefs or faith in an afterlife. Dasein itself always has the possibility of evading its death, but in the final analysis it cannot evade it. The past scatters all secretiveness and busyness. The past takes with it everything into the nothing. In being towards its death, Dasein is running towards that moment when its past is complete. And this indeed defines the temporality of Dasein as essentially futural in its orientation, even futural with regards to its own past. Nostalgia itself being a modification of our relation to the future. Now, for the first time, discussing the very structure of Dasein's temporality, Heidegger writes, the present always arrives from the future and passes into the past, and elements of the past return to us only in the future. How we relate to this temporalizing of our temporality, and not just the mere passage of time, is existentially important. And furthermore, for Heidegger, it's a formalistic relation that defines us and our ethics or way of being in the world. In always running ahead of itself into the future, Dasein is its future, that in this being futural, it comes back to its past and present. Dasein, conceived in its most extreme possibility of being, is thus for Heidegger time itself and not in time. And being futural, as Heidegger has characterized it, is the authentic how of being temporal. The futural is that way of being of Dasein in which and out of which it gives itself its time. To have no time, to constantly be harried in inauthenticity and busyness, means to cast time into the bad present of the everyday. If we live for the moment always on the basis of the past and our nostalgia for certain parts of it, then we miss the authentic being of Dasein as temporalizing temporality. For it is being futural that gives time, that cultivates the present, and allows the past to be repeated in how it is lived. On the basis of this hermeneutic phenomenology of Dasein's temporality, Heidegger now makes his first major claim about time itself. Remember, not clock time, but the temporality of Dasein, as a being that gives itself its time. With regards to time, this means that the fundamental phenomena of time is the future. Physicists may be wont to describe all three dimensions of time as on an equal footing, as part of the web and nexus of causality, as the very nature of the play of time-space. But when we look closely into the time of Dasein, as spirit or as temporalizing, we find this priority of the future as the fundamental phenomena of Dasein's time. In order to see this without selling it as an interesting paradox, each specific Dasein must maintain itself as a running ahead that is into the future. In so doing, it becomes manifest that the original way of dealing with time is not a measuring, not a situating in clock time or a sequence of befores and after according to the law of causality. Time, in the sense of duration, never becomes long or short because it originally has no length. Rather, lived duration, and this is a point that Heidegger takes from Bergson, is always a questioning running ahead into the future. Such questioning does not seize the indeterminacy of the certainty of the past, but precisely wishes to determine indeterminate time. In other words, the very being or conatus of Dasein, its nature, as a being of temporality, is to determine the indeterminate. That is, to have a present relation to the arrival of the future. In fact, to impact and influence this future, and thus determine time. This determination of time on the part of the being of Dasein, Heidegger names here futuricity, and says it's the most essential phenomena of time, in which Dasein has the opportunity not to lose its time. Being futural as a possibility of Dasein's JEWEILIKKEIT gives time because it is time itself, and thus it simultaneously becomes visible that the question of how much time, how long, and when becomes inappropriate. We are always falling from authentic temporalization into a determination or measuring of futurity, but this question is inappropriate to time. Only if I say that time authentically has no time to calculate time is this an appropriate assertion. Dasein reckons with and asks after the how much of time and is therefore never alongside time in its authenticity. Rather, Dasein always is this time in its possible authenticity or inauthenticity. For when asking about the when and the how much, like children asking when a car ride will be over, or like adults seeking more of a good thing, in both these modes, Dasein loses its time. I wish only to comment here that Heidegger appears to me like a new Descartes, applying the methods of Husserlian phenomenology, phenomenological reduction, bracketing, or epoche, to the traditional concept of time that we've inherited. He succeeds in exploring a realm of our lived phenomenology of time that has been covered over again and again in the philosophy of time. Rather than arriving at the simple moment of the I think that schematizes space-time and relegates it to the realm of extended substance over and against a thinking substance, Heidegger's Dasein as being in the world is temporalizing and thus is time. This is for Heidegger the new version of Cartesian certainty. And it is a hard-won insight. How often do we really wish to interpret ourselves as beings of time who determine our time from the future? Next, we hear of the great Heideggerian theme of the uncanniness of Dasein, the unhomeliness of our being in the world. Dasein is a being who is fundamentally uncanny because it is always in search of lost time, as in the title of Marcel Proust's great novel. How do things stand with this asking as an asking that loses time? Where has time gotten off to? Where has it gone? Here Heidegger notes that precisely that Dasein which reckons with time and lives with its watch constantly in its hands, this Dasein that reckons with time constantly is the very one who says, I have no time. A bit like the White Rabbit in Alice in Wonderland. Does it not thereby betray itself in what it does with time, insofar as it itself is, after all, time? Heidegger is aghast. Losing time and acquiring a clock for the purpose of retaining it? Does not the uncanniness of Dasein erupt here? We are indeed very uncanny beings, if we are beings of time constantly in search of lost time, who at the same time give up our futural relation to our being in order to measure ourselves by a clock. A roommate recently gave me this very uncanny diagram, my life in weeks. Each week is a tiny little box, and the vertical column are the years that have passed. I am currently almost completed my 41st year. The columns continue only to year 90, a very long life expectancy, probably to quell my anxiety regarding the fact that should I have filled out this chart, my life would have revealed itself to be more than half complete. Does not the uncanniness of Dasein erupt when we look at a chart like this? It seems precisely designed to invoke this uncanniness, but in a New Age mode. Heidegger's next move is to point us to the prevailing presencing of the present, the being of the now. Everything that is encountered in the world is encountered by Dasein as residing in the now. Only the now time, Jetztzeit, is lived. In the now, Dasein encounters the time that it is in each case, but as present. And this is Dasein as concern or care always absorbed in the present, but nevertheless alongside a not yet, to which we always attend in taking care of it. Heidegger's next move is even more disconcerting. Even in the present of its concern, Dasein is the whole of time, and in such a way that it does not get rid of the future. Wouldn't it be great if Dasein could evacuate time, wholly take control of its future and utterly remember its past? If it could do this, it could live wholly in the moment, as many philosophies recommend. To live in the moment and only in the moment is for Heidegger inauthenticity itself. It does not grasp that the being that Dasein is always already the whole of time, and that the present only exists on the basis of its arrival from the future. It cannot merely focus on the now without living inauthentically in regards to what time itself is, that is, futuricity. And this is why caring for the present always turns to an inowning, that is, an appropriation of the future, whether it admits this to itself or not. And in caring for its temporality, the future becomes that to which care clings. Not, in the first instance, the authentic futural being of the past, but the future that the present itself cultivates for itself as its own. And this because the past, as the authentic future, can never become present. What Heidegger here calls the authentic futural being of the past would be accessible only in death or the nothing. And so the futuricity to which our care clings is such by grace always of the present. And Dasein, as absorbed in the now of the present world, is little ready to admit that it has stolen away from authentic futuricity. First, we wish to live wholly in the present, then in the present that determines its future. But in both these modes, we overlook that our very being as temporality involves also the past, without whose presence no authentic futuricity is possible. Next, Heidegger broaches a topic that he'll more extensively develop in the 1929 lectures, The Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics. Dasein as temporality is always evading futuricity, and this is the empty time of boredom. Time suddenly becomes long for Dasein as being present. Time becomes boring precisely because Dasein measures it with a how much. How long is this lecture going to be, for instance? Which in advance makes time long. Here we find the theme of the Heideggerian focusing of attention, or mindfulness, Besinnung. We are constantly coming back, that is, engaging in our running ahead. Even in the midst of a lecture like this, then the past never becomes boring. Rather, the basis upon which the lecture itself, its past and future, unfolds. In general, Dasein would like to constantly encounter new things in its own present. This is the appeal of novelty. And here I can assure you with Heidegger that everything following in this lecture will be an encountering of new and exciting things in future presents, which have not yet arrived, so don't give up yet. Despite these warnings and entreaties, everything will, of course, get reduced to clock time. How interminably long was that lecture? And so difficult, too. Anything but reckoning with Heidegger. I think I'll evade him and it and tranquilize my mounting anxiety at this point. When we do this for Heidegger, we fall into inauthenticity and we cease to learn. What he recommends as an antidote to evading futuricity and the empty time of boredom, the time that always needs to be filled with novel things, is a caring inception of the very temporality of our generation. And not only ours, but of all generations, what Heidegger will soon call historicity. Heidegger's insight is stunning at this point. We would rather level down our own temporalizing experience and invent metaphysics, that is, rely on our naive conception of the nature of things and naive creation of the very concept of nature, rather than accede to our authenticity resolutely. And for this reason, everydayness speaks of itself as that within which nature is constantly encountered. For Heidegger, actually, our word nature has long lost the naming power of the ancient Greek word physis. We use the term nature to denote the totality of beings in the world, that is, entities reduced to the present or its presence, and we think these entities in terms of metaphysical categories such as time, space, or matter-energy. A deeper apprehension of nature in the Greek sense of physis would involve the recognition that all phenomena of presencing and absencing are temporal. Everything that occurs rolls out of an infinite future and into an irretrievable past. This is what the ancient Greeks named when they said physis. But uncannily, it's not what we moderns name. We'd much prefer to fix the very nature of nature as something accessible in a present, rather than to perceive that Dasein, as much as nature, is time. That is a process of presencing and absencing, or temporal ecstasis, as we'll hear in a moment. The scope of this lecture is truly astonishing, because having indicated in broad outline the hermeneutic phenomenology of Dasein as time, Heidegger's next move is to return to where the lecture began, that is, in physics. He here addresses how the problem of time's arrow and the now relates across discourse in the physical sciences and Dasein's hermeneutic of itself as time. According to the mainstream view in physics, there are of course exceptions and outliers. World time itself has a direction. It always moves from before to after, passing only lightly upon a present, and that present always being defined by a particular perspective or orientation in time-space, and ever determined by the matters that are encountered in the now. According to these postulates, time is thus 1, irreversible, and 2, a homogeneous sequence of now points. The irreversibility of time being the cosmic perspective, and the homogeneous sequence of now points being the perspectival within the universal. In a very great work on the philosophy of physics, Hugh Price, who I actually studied under when I was on an exchange semester at the University of Sydney, engages a debate with Stephen Hawking on this very concept of time's arrow, and argues that its reversibility is as plausible as its irreversibility, precisely in light of the fact that the now may be heterogeneous to itself, as is taught in the basic principles of quantum mechanics. Heidegger does not here wish to engage in such debates, time's arrow as irreversible. This well applies to Dasein, for whom time does always move between before and after, and for whom whatever remains of authentic time is something to be seized upon. The point of view of our existential experience of time, whatever remains of futurity, is the phenomena of time as Dasein. Within time's arrow, there is only so much time left in which we can be. On the concept of a homogenized sequence of now points, that this is an assimilation of time to space. In fact, when physicists speak of the now as a purely homogeneous sequence of points in perspective, they have reduced time to space to presence, pure and simple. The principle of homogeneity is needed in order to expel all time from itself into a present, and thus, according to time's arrow and its two principles of irreversibility and homogeneity, time becomes fully mathematized. That is, mere coordinate t alongside the spatial coordinates x, y, and z. This is the understanding of time as a sort of fourth dimension that is supervenient upon three-dimensional space. Furthermore, most physicists posit that since time is irreversible, it resists any ultimate mathematization, can attempt to acquire the grand unified field theory, a fundamental set of equations that mathematizes the whole universe from the perspective of the Big Bang or origin. No set of equations could ever be complex enough to determine all the contingent or accidental events that occur on account of the fact that time, as irreversible, always has itself a future, can only be predicted to a certain extent. There is no equation complex enough to account for the entire unanticipatable future of the cosmos, nor for all the events that unfold in a human life. And this is because numbers are not earlier or later. In fact, they are not in time at all. Earlier and later are quite determinate before and after. Indeed, once time has been defined as clock time, even the world time, what evaporates is any hope of ever arriving at its original meaning again, as temporalizing. For Heidegger, time is not the fourth coordinate axis alongside space and its matter, a mere container in which things exist and unfold, but rather a process that always renews itself within nature. From outside the system, we can say that time indeed has an arrow, but from any point within it, it must remain uncertain. This is not to deny the findings and predictions of physics, such as the sun's inevitable heat death or explosion, simply to point out that time, especially as it is lived by Dasein, remains a mystery, that even on the whole we cannot say for certain whether time has an arrow or not. We simply lack that grand perspective. A well-known Heidegger translator and scholar provides a very helpful and succinct note here on the difference between cosmic time and the temporality of Dasein. In Being in Time, Heidegger will explain that PRESCIENCE, his fancy German term for what is and is present, refers to the temporal horizon of presence, Gegenwart. And this cosmic time belongs to the temporality of being, and is not the same as the extative or ecstatic temporality of Dasein. More simply, cosmic time is Temporalität, unfolding always from being as what is. Dasein, however, is a being of ecstatic temporality, Zeitlichkeit. Ordinarily, we oppose the temporality of Dasein to what is eternal, but always is. But in Heidegger, being as well has a temporality, lest we could not explain time in a cosmic perspective. This is an important note. So far, the concept of time lecture has focused exclusively on Dasein's temporality, as specificity, JEWEILIKKEIT, mindness, Gemeinigkeit, and discussed the transition from everydayness to authenticity in terms of being towards death, and Dasein or time as futurity. What it has not discussed, but only hinted at, is how Dasein's temporality is open to and relates to, or is even determined by the temporality of being. Glimmers of this theme remains in Heidegger's claim that Dasein flees in the face of futurity. What Dasein flees in the face of futurity is nothing other than being itself in its Temporalität, truth or temporal unfolding. So rather than oppose Heidegger 1 to Heidegger 2 or the Heidegger of Being in Time to the later Heidegger, focuses on the event of the truth of being or Reignis, already in 1924, being itself has a history. It gives the time-place-space of history as its Seinsgeschichte. This is only glimpsed in Dasein's historicity. Who knew 20th century existentialism would end up having such deep roots, not only in the hermeneutic phenomenology of Dasein, but in a very precise account on Heidegger's part, not only of how the findings of phenomenology are not inconsistent with modern physics, but also of a new paradigm as to the primacy of ontology itself in regards to the sciences and the need of the sciences to more deeply reckon with the temporality of being, i.e. not simply to reduce time to a sequence of now points within the presence of irreversibility. Enough on the embeddedness of Heidegger's prescience of time within the science of time. Heidegger's next move is to ask how the discipline of history might be related to Dasein's historicity. This is one of Heidegger's enduring quirks. He loved studying history, the work of historians, but he was always shocked and appalled at how each historian invariably imported, and could not help but import, a naive ontology based on the spirit of his own time into his research. Great works of history are often marred by an inability of the historian to situate his research within the experience of being, time, and history of the past that he studies. This is not a failing of the historian as a historiographer, and great historians supersede the limited perspective of the present all the time. But here Heidegger makes a fundamental distinction. There is, on the one hand, the discipline of history, and on the other, Dasein, time, as historicity. Historicity is only ever lived and recovered now, the temporal ecstasis of Dasein. Dasein cannot help but only ever see the past history as historiography. That way of viewing history arises in the present, that is, as the way of viewing history which arises in the present and merely sees history as an irretrievable busyness, what was going on in the past. Contemplation of what was going on is inexhaustible, and it loses itself in its material. And this because the history and temporality of the present utterly fails to attain the past. History is always done merely in another present. closure of the deep past with respect to the present is insurmountable. The past remains closed off from any and all, so long as such a present, Dasein, is not itself historical. Dasein, however, becomes historical, and paradigm shifts occur in the historical sciences only insofar as we become a possibility. In being futural, Dasein is its past, it comes back to it in the how, and this manner of coming back is, among other things, conscience. Heidegger says among other things here because he's referring to the intellectual conscience of historians and how their very futurity re-anchors them in the past in new ways. And he's also referring to the existential dimension of conscience. For it is only on account of conscience, as the comparison of temporal perspectives, Dasein's own in this life, and the perspectives of the past, that their how or way of being can be repeated, can be something to which we return again and again. When we approach history in this way, in terms of the intellectual, indeed the existential conscience, only then can we speak of the history of ideas, as well as lived experience, as things to which we return again and again. And in regards to this difference between historiography and history, it's always the same old story. The present generation always believes that it's founded a new history, and even thinks that it is overburdened with history. I think Heidegger's target here must be the work of Oswald Spengler. History becomes such a rich field of investigation that historians moan about historicism, and come to call history something which is not history at all, but which is actually an intervention in the present on behalf of the future. History attempts to bring light to the darkness, to access the grove or darkness of the past or unconscious that does not yet shine into the present, i.e. to discover what has been concealed. And in this way, each contemporary Dasein in each successive generation loses itself in the present and in its own vision, its own pseudo-history, and from there feels entitled to use the last remainder of its temporality in order to steal away from time, from itself as Dasein, into the it was, to rest its very being in the past, and to what is supposedly immortal or eternal, but must always repeat itself in each successive generation. And it is on this fantastical path to the suprahistorical that we are supposed to find the worldview, the Weltanschauung. That is the historical uncanniness that supposedly constitutes the time of every present. Heidegger's targets here are complex, and they might not map well onto contemporary history, which more resolves to busy itself with the factical. In Heidegger's era, history was unafraid of grandiose claims and the historical situating of various worldviews. It was still mostly, despite the efforts of historians like Jakob Burckhardt, and under the influence of Hegel's philosophy, history as universal history, a monumental fictional construction that Nietzsche had already critiqued in his essay The Uses and Abuses of History for Life. No less did Nietzsche critique antiquarian history and what we might recognize as the absorptions of historians in particulars and facts. But that for another lecture. The basic point here can be more simply expressed. Dasein's relationship to its own history and temporality is uncanny, and this always constitutes the time of its present. I fully realize that Heidegger's essay here is well over our heads, especially for my students at a state university in California. We are simply not used to thinking so deeply about anything. So for anyone still listening, here's the most basic takeaway. Dasein is time, and our existence is historical. We worry about relativism in our viewpoints and opinions, but this is not yet essential anxiety. Essential or existential anxiety arises only as the possibility or impossibility of our own becoming. The possibility of our access to history is grounded in the possibility according to which any specific present understands how to be futural. And for Heidegger, this is the first principle of all hermeneutics, of all interpretation of Dasein. Earlier, Heidegger had said that Dasein is time. Now this is taken to mean that the being of Dasein is historicity itself. Philosophy will never get to the root of what history is, so long as it analyzes history as an object of contemplation or method. The enigma of history lies in what it means to be historical. And so summing up, nearing the conclusion of his piece, time is Dasein. Dasein is my specificity, and this can be the specificity in what is futural by running ahead to the certain yet indeterminate past. Dasein always is in the manner of its possible temporal being. Dasein is time, and time is temporal. The phrase time is temporal seems like a tautology, but it's not, and this is because being and time are not the same. Dasein is its past, and it also is its possibility in running ahead to its past. And in this running ahead, Heidegger says, I am authentically time. I have time. Insofar as time is in each case mine, there are many times. In the language of traditional metaphysics, what this means is that time is the principle of individuation. It is for the most part understood in terms of irreversible succession, the time of the present and the time of nature or the cosmos. And yet time as temporality is lived authentically by Dasein and is its principle of individuation. I.e., time is the starting point in which Dasein lives its specificity. In being futural, in running ahead, the Dasein that on average is becomes itself. In running ahead, it becomes visible as this one singular uniqueness of its singular fate in the possibility of its singular past. And what is properly peculiar about this individuation is that it strikes down all becoming exceptional. It's often said that everyone is equal before death. This is extended to mean that time individuates everyone in such a way that it makes us all equal. Being, the future, death are the great levelers. Das Man determines the time of inauthenticity is no match. In the how of our existence, the what dissolves into dust. In other words, the temporality or Zeitlichkeit of Dasein is always its how. And this how is where we must look in order to understand the being that we are. No traditional answer regarding the what, no metaphysics of the soul or the singular subject will suffice. They all dissolve into dust. In the conclusion, Heidegger declares his wish to put authentic repetition to the test. German eigentlich Wiederholung. It's not enough to say that Dasein is time, is historicity. If this doctrine is correct, it must endure the possibility of historical repetition. Aristotle often used to emphasize in his writings that the most important thing is the correct idea, original assurance or education in a matter, emerging always from a familiarity with the matter itself, or the assurance of the appropriate way of dealing with any matter. In order to speak in keeping with the ontological character of our theme here, we must talk temporally about time. We wish to repeat temporally the question of what time is, and here Heidegger concludes, time is the how. If we inquire into what time is, then one may not cling prematurely to an answer. Time is such and such, for this always means a what, predetermined by a metaphysics of time. Such metaphysical predetermination of the very time of Dasein is always questionable. Let us disregard the answer and repeat the question. What happened to the question of the lecture, i.e., what is time? It has transformed itself and has become the question, who is time? More closely, are we ourselves time? Or closer still, am I my time? In this way, I come closest to it, and if I understand the question correctly, it is then taken completely seriously. Such questioning is thus the most appropriate manner of access to and of dealing with time, as in each case mine. The last sentence of this lecture, Dasein would then be being questionable. I feel very uncanny about the excessive Heideggerizing that was necessary to get through this seminal lecture by a great philosopher, and had to repress many worries and concerns that crept up for me along the way regarding whether the more difficult twists and turns here were in any way meaningful philosophy, or if they were not a kind of magical spell or charm, and doubtless enchantments no longer suitable to our own age. Did Heidegger in fact carve out more authentic access to Dasein as time and history in this essay? Or did he not rather wow and infuriate us with the impenetrability of his path of thought? One thing remains at the end of this discourse, that Dasein is a being questionable to itself, so I guess each of us reading the essay for ourselves must decide. In any case, one of the neat outcomes of having read and digested the Concept of Time lecture is that at least some of being in time should now be a lot more readable and understandable than previously. Of course, we don't have time to read all of Division 1 in this class, which was focused on Dasein's spatiality or inauthenticity in any case. But we might be surprised after reading the Concept of Time lecture, much more lucid the first 5 pages of Division 2, Dasein and Temporality becomes. For the transition from Division 1 to Division 2 is from inauthenticity to authenticity. Let's see how they read now, at least the first few sentences, having at least attempted to follow Heidegger through the difficult terrain of his Concept of Time lecture. Remember, Dasein is futuricity, and so the possible ranks higher than the actual. Dasein's ontological experience of itself is as a being of possibility. It can never be predetermined by the actual or the history of metaphysics. might ask cynically and a bit skeptically, what have we gained? And to this, Heidegger answers with more assurance. In his transition to Division 2, we have found the fundamental constitution of the being in question, being in the world whose essential structures are centered in disclosedness. The totality of the structural whole, Dasein, revealed itself as care. The being of Dasein is contained in care, and the term existence formally indicates that Dasein is, as an understanding, potentiality of being which is concerned in its being about its being. So far so good, and hard to argue with that. Heidegger is now looking for an answer to the question of the meaning of being, and the way leads through a primordial interpretation of Dasein's authenticity and potentiality for being a whole. Can we proceed from the being of Dasein as care to the question of the primordial unity of this structural totality? Yes, but only in the mode of authenticity. Yet authenticity is never total. You may notice here a repetition of certain themes in the concept of time lecture. Dasein exists in everydayness, always between birth and death, and is always not yet something it will be so long as it is. In what sense, then, can authenticity or totality ever be attained? Only as running ahead or being towards. In other words, the existential arena, Dasein as it is lived, must attain to existential self-understanding, the being of Dasein. And this is where authentic temporalizing versus everydayness comes in. The time to be authentic, to temporalize your temporality, is always now. The being of Dasein is care, but what is the meaning of care in light of the analysis of Dasein as temporality? Meaning, Heidegger reminds us, is always that wherein understandability maintains itself. Authentic existence means accepting one's thrownness and looking forward without blinking at one's potentialities, including one's death. In anticipation, one grasps being towards death, and with resolution, one takes up responsibility for the self that one has become. And here we find that the meaning of care involves guilt, which is revealed to us by the voice of conscience. No, not a little angel versus a demon determining right or wrong moral actions, but the voice of conscience in the fundamental sense of your existential self-understanding. Such authenticity is not a mode of existence distinct from your inauthenticity. It is rather a grasping of yourself as having been, as projecting into a very specific future because of what you have been, and of living realistically in the present in light of the ecstasizing, that is, the happening of temporality. Time is the meaning of Dasein's being. What is the book Being in Time all about? And why do we bother trying to learn this stuff, given its enormous difficulty and the fact that our existence will always remain a problem for us? Well, I suppose that at some level it might be comforting to know that if Heidegger is right, if Dasein is time and history, always temporalizing itself in light of its historicity, that someone out there like Heidegger, or people who bother to read him, have investigated these basic questions which structure Division 2. Is there a possible being whole of Dasein, attainable in being towards death? Can we attest or give any testimonial to Dasein's authentic potentiality of being in resoluteness? Do we in fact attain to an authentic potentiality for being a whole? And is temporality the ontological meaning of Dasein as care? How does temporality, Dasein's own, and the temporality of being relate to everydayness? And how does it relate to historicity, as well as to within-timeness as the origin of our vulgar concept of time? These topics constitute the 6 chapters of Division 2 of Being in Time. And probably they provide as good answers to these questions as we'll ever get, which might be a good reason to read Heidegger for yourself. Later Heidegger scholarship, and even Heidegger himself, tended to see this whole project as too subjectivistic. That is, as still too much based in willing and decision, or the technical term Entschlossenheit, resoluteness. In accordance with the ancient both Greek and Judeo-Christian command, awake and be sober, only then will you understand your being. The later Heidegger, by contrast, could be considered as a kind of quietist, privileging letting be, although still using the method of formal indication, or hermeneutical phenomenology, without, however, naming it so explicitly, rather concealing the truth of his thought in signs and hints. For most Heidegger scholars, however, we will never be done with either Division 1 or Division 2 of Being in Time. And this is because the existential questions, or the questionability of Dasein, which Heidegger proposes and articulates in its existential structure, cannot in fact be evaded or tranquilized. Most interpretations of Division 2 of being and time fail to see much beyond Heidegger's analysis of being towards death. That is a futuricity, and this is well and good, for futuricity indeed comes first for beings like Dasein who are already living. However, there is another theme that subtends Division 2 which is equally important, and that is being towards birth, what the concept of time lecture understood as the irretrievable past. And at last, Heidegger's meanderings become more intelligible. We, Dasein, beings that are always between natality and mortality. Not simply the events of birth and death on clock time, but the ontological realities of birthing and of dying. And in this way, being in time's account of authenticity as a resolute being towards death is complemented by his more poetic or Hölderlinian account of authenticity in the 1930s and earlier 1940s. We are not only being towards death, but also being towards new beginnings, which are accessible to us only in the composed letting be or Gelassenheit and even leisurely wonder of the ontological festival. Here, the very hope that we might become what we are. An excellent Heidegger scholar who used to teach at the New School for Social Research in New York, Rainer Sherman, thus speaks of Division 2 in terms of the thrusts of pure natality, as beginnings through which living beings annul and evade mortifying influences and maximize their living being into absolute positions. According to Sherman, natality is the thetic fever in us that if it could rule alone, or if it could subsume under itself the counter-strategy of death, it would produce an ideal frenzy. It would affirm the figure of an unrestrained, all-encompassing holding together. In Heidegger, this is the temporal difference between natality and mortality, as he says in Division 2, the end and the beginning, death and birth, as the two poles in which Dasein's totality is closed around. And so, summing up Heidegger on death, in his words, death is a being towards death, an anxious, anticipatory being towards the possibility of an impossibility, towards the non-being of Dasein as what is most outstanding, non-relational, insuperable, and certain. But despite this sober, resolute emphasis on the individualized being of Dasein in anxiety, as the grounding attunement of Dasein's very being, the Heidegger of Division 2 does not preclude an unshakable joy in this possibility. And this appearance of the theme of unshakable joy, indeed the priority of unshakable joy over anxiety as the basic ontological attunement, and as the force of pure natality or rebirthing, developing an authentic relation to the past, is what animates the entire movement of Division 2 of being in time. Natality, or the will to life, what Spinoza called conatus, and what Unamuno pursued as immortality, indeed wins out along Heidegger's path of thought, one of the key sayings of his later thought being, the human being is not the lord of beings, but the shepherd of being. This inception of a task for the essence of humanity being always set alongside the realization that death is the most certain possibility. One could say, in the language of the contemporary discourse of religious studies, that Heidegger in this saying avows a stewardship theology, overturning a very Old Testament in which God grants to Adam and Eve mastery or lordship in the garden. But the human being is not a god, is not the lord of beings, but rather the shepherd or the steward of being. It is a wonder, therefore, that stewardship theology has tended to completely ignore this dimension of the later Heidegger, which would, in fact, if it were investigated, provide its own ontological or historical grounding. Before moving on from Heidegger's being in time, it is worth noting what Heidegger himself acknowledges as a petitio principii in his analysis of death. That is a logical fallacy in which the conclusions are presupposed in the premises, also known as begging the question. For Heidegger's ontological analysis of death and being in time not only demands its existential attestation, the testimony of our being towards death, but it in fact presumes that an authentic being towards death might have already granted the meaning of being. Heidegger acknowledges this imported assumption when he writes, the task of adequately carrying out the ontological analysis of end and wholeness gets stranded not only because the theme is so far-reaching, but because there is a difficulty in principle. In order to master this task, we must presuppose that precisely what we are seeking in this inquiry, the meaning of being in general, is something we have found already and with which we are quite familiar. This is framed as a methodologically sound begging of the question, but it also points back to the specific experience of the man Heidegger, his own being towards death at some moment in time, and perhaps within that, the unfolding of the existential structures that the rest of being in time will go on to articulate, and even a presupposition of the notion that the meaning of being in general is something with which he is quite familiar. That is on the basis of these temporalizing structures, no doubt recalled from initiatory memory. By 1936-7, in what is sometimes called his second magnum opus, The Contributions to Philosophy from the Event, Heidegger in fact looks back at the existential analysis of death and being in time, very much along these lines, writing, "Being towards death, in the most veiled forms, is the goad of highest historicality and is the secret ground of the decidedness towards the shortest path. The uniqueness of death in human Dasein belongs to the most original determination of Dasein, namely to be appropriated by being itself in order to ground this latter in its truth as the openness of self-concealing." And he looks back to the analysis of being in time, asking, what is the relation of Dasein to death itself, i.e., what is the connection between resoluteness, openness, and death, namely in our running ahead towards death. This running ahead towards death is not to be made visible for the sake of attaining mere nothingness, but just the opposite, so that openness for being might be disclosed fully and out of what is most extreme. Within Heidegger's later thinking of the event or ereigness of being, it seems that being towards death has more fully become a moment in Dasein's temporalization of the temporality of being. Now, in introducing the later Heidegger, we can say that his output after being in time is simply enormous. His collected works run to over 100 volumes. And that despite some troubling courses and speeches during and shortly after his Nazi phase, Heidegger's overall philosophy continues to develop and mature, could not strictly be categorized as a Nazism. The later thinking is often characterized as a turn from metaphysics to poetry, from will and resoluteness to releasement and letting be, and from hermeneutic phenomenology of Dasein to a thinking of being an event. In the coming weeks, we will examine just a handful of more accessible pieces and a few shorter, challenging ones from his later writings. Our main themes will be the nature of philosophy, science, contemporary world picture, philosophy of nature, poetry, religion, dwelling, and the spirit. This week, and more briefly, in completing this video, we'll look at two selections in particular: What is Philosophy, a lecture delivered in 1955, and On the Age of the World Picture in 1938. Both are short and much more readable pieces, and both fill in a number of gaps in our understanding of Heidegger's thought. If your interest is more in how the history of philosophy, specifically ancient Greek philosophy, informs Heidegger's existentialism, although by now we know we can't quite call it that, then What is Philosophy is probably the place to go next. If your interest is to try and understand how the worldview of contemporary science interfaces with Heidegger's existential thought, then read The Age of the World Picture. Qu'est-ce que c'est que la philosophie? Was ist das, die Philosophie? This was a lecture delivered in the context of Heidegger's collaboration with French philosophers during the 1950s. It took place at Quercy-la-Salle. Negatively, we can say this lecture shows Heidegger's Greek-centric vision of the world in full force. That is, his ethnocentrism. Only the Greeks invented philosophy, and thus European history and modern science. Positively, it is an extremely well-written and thought-provoking account of the unity and multiplicity characteristic of essential philosophizing. And if Heidegger's main argument is correct here, one of the consequences is that the Greeks were the original existentialists, and this in the thick sense that they invented the question of what is quidditas, and did so from out of a profound experience of the being of beings and Dasein's being. And so in Heidegger, existential thought is wrested free completely of humanism, becomes at least in part a recovery or retrieval of an ancient way of being and thinking, according to which all being is in being, and according to the Logos. Beginning with the question, what is philosophy? Heidegger turned to the Greeks and their term philosophia as a striving yearning after being, a practice invented by the pre-Socratics, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. As Aristotle says in his Metaphysics, and moreover, that which is sought both of old and now and forever missed is this, what is being. Philosophy has remained the same despite many changes, from Aristotle to Nietzsche, indeed from Aristotle to Heidegger. The basic question of existence has been with us for a very long time. It's intellectually dishonest when we isolate it as an existentialism class as a product of the 19th and the 20th century. According to Heidegger, philosophers are addressed by the very being of beings and correspond to this appeal or Zuspruch. The philosopher for Heidegger is quite literally a first responder to the tuning or voice of being and disposed from and in relation to, attuned within, the clearing of being. And this is also in part why Heidegger no longer speaks the language of modern phenomenology. The ancient philosophers were, read correctly, in fact, indigenous phenomenologists already. It is in contemporary thinking, dating initially to the age of the professors, to scholastics in Roman antiquity, and then the later Christian scholastics leading up to the dawn of modern philosophy, that we owe all the trouble. We owe the very problem of the forgetting of being. In Descartes, the attunement of the philosopher is one of doubt and certainty rather than wonder and enthusiasm. And in modern philosophy, such as Hegel, Schelling, Marx, and Nietzsche, metaphysics becomes complete but remains open. According to Heidegger, our contemporary thinking has not yet found its unequivocal path. What we come across is only this: various tunings of thinking. Doubt and despair on the one hand and conflict with one another. Fear and anxiety becoming mixed with hope and confidence. These are the fundamental attunements of modern thought, and very often even it looks as though thinking becomes completely a reasoning, conception, and calculation, free of any kind of grounding attunement or tuning. But this is a self-deception. For even in modern thought, the expressly adopted and unfolding correspondence to the appeal of the being of beings is philosophy. Remember the notion that the past is inaccessible to us except from the future? Heidegger applies this consistently. Even Aristotle arrives from the future. For when we read fundamental philosophy, or even poetry for that matter, we correspond through language to things which give lavishly of themselves from out of the appeal of the being of beings. What is philosophy? We must first note that it is a questioning which admits of no fixed program, but always involves a preparation for thinking the being of beings in many ways, not only the fourfold sense of being in Aristotle, but the basic determination of being in each of the major thinkers in the history of Western thought. Heidegger here quotes Aristotle, translating him beautifully into German. Beingness appears in many guises, and existence is revealed in many ways. Let that serve as a general introduction to this highly readable public talk. I hope you enjoy. Next up, a very brief summary of some of the themes in the Age of the World picture. Almost 20 years earlier, in 1938, under the title The Establishing by Metaphysics of the Modern World Picture. The beginning and end of it is most relevant for our course in existentialism, the middle parts involving an extensive analysis of modern science. It begins with a stunning inventory of the features of the present age. Our world and its contemporary world picture is defined by modern science, machine technology, the transformation of art into aesthetics, the transformation of the human good into the culture industry and politics, and lastly, the loss of the gods or withdrawal of the traces of the holy. All five features characterize our era still. Let's look more closely now just at the fifth. Heidegger, the loss of the gods is a fundamental existential event and entails the transformation of the very meaning of religion. And it's happened over centuries according to a twofold process. One, the world picture became Christianized, inasmuch as the cause of the world was posited as an infinite, unconditional, absolute being, God. And two, Christendom transformed the Christian doctrine into a worldview, the Christian worldview, and in that way made itself modern and up to date. The loss of the immanent or direct experience of the divine, the gods, or the Godhead, is a situation of indecision regarding God and the gods. And Christendom has the greatest share for Heidegger in bringing this about. But the loss of the gods is so far from excluding religiosity that rather only through the loss is the relation to the gods changed into a mere religious experience. This is a very subtle and important point. We speak of religious revelation, whether it's possible or not, of our own religious revelations or our lack thereof, and of the religious revelations granted to the founders of various traditions. In all this, we take for granted that the religious experience itself is something extraordinary, out of the ordinary and normal course of day-to-day life. At the same time, we define religion in terms of belief or faith in things which are unexperienced. Both these ways of thinking about religion simply were unavailable to ancient cultures prior to the emergence of empire, first involving a transformation of the gods, and next their eventual withdrawal to the transcendence of a single henotheistic deity. It was only by the 7th or 8th century CE the loss and withdrawal of the gods was complete. that people could even live in a world in which religious experience was either possible or impossible, accessible or inaccessible. And for Heidegger, the minute we think of religion in terms of either faith or mere religious experience, the gods have already fled. The resultant void becomes compensated for by means of historiographical and psychological investigation of myth. In their invention of the modern concept of myth is not the same as the ancient Greek notion of mythos as saga or saying of the way things are. Now, alongside this rise of modern science, machine technology, the transformation of art into aesthetics, and of the human good into the culture industry and politics, each of these themes being explored in more detail in the essay, but being a bit more straightforward than this theme of the loss of the gods. What all five of these themes have in common, according to Heidegger, is the rise of subjectivism and individualism. After a long discussion of the essence of science, Heidegger finally defines what he takes to be our contemporary world picture, or Weltbild. Modern age liberates man and produces two results: subjectivism and individualism. It is not that the modern age lacks objectivity and a sense for the value of collectivity. It has also produced incomparable objectivisms and collectivisms, but these are precisely the result of its subjectivism. The modern individual has more or less become lost in his identity as the thinking subject. The Greeks, however, conceived the subject completely differently. The Latin subjectum went back to the Greek hypokaimenon, and it meant more phenomenologically what lies under and before the ground that gathers a thing into its thingness. Aristotle would speak of things as terms of substance, ousia. Ousia being a presencing of some present thing, its beingness, and the hypokaimenon being what lies under or before such beingness. It was only in the modern period of philosophy that the subjectum, or hypokaimenon, came to be known as the I, wit as the very ground of being and truth. This, of course, involves a complete separation of the human subject from nature, or phusis, the investigation into nature, or phusis, being the Greeks' original response to all questions concerning the hypokaimenon. And by reducing hypokaimenon or subjectum, what underlies, to the I, the moderns invented humanism. And according to Heidegger, it was not the Greeks, despite the sophists or the medievals, who invented humanism. Even in Protagoras' statement that man is the measure of things, often touted as a source for Greek humanism, such excessive emphasis on the I, or the subject, is not to be found, nor is it found in medieval scholastics, despite Augustine's increasing interiority, nor is it even to be found at the very outset of the Renaissance, such as in Pico della Mirandola's definition of the human being as a chameleon, always transforming itself into different levels of the great chain of being. It is only later that the I itself comes to bear the entire weight of being the subject, the thinking thing of Descartes, which must recreate or spin the web of the world from out of itself as a spider, above all in terms of the subject-object dichotomy. And it is these roots of Cartesian science that are eventually taken over into the scientific revolution and the methods of modern science, such that modern physics can exert itself to establish the world's formula, reducing and resolving the beings of all entities in the world to what is totally calculable. This modern scientific picture of the world is obviously a picture of the world. Heidegger next asks, what does world mean here, and what does picture mean here? World, he avers, serves as a name for what is in its entirety. The name is not limited to the cosmos, to nature, for history also belongs to the world. But even nature and history, and both interpenetrating in their underlying and transcending of one another, do not exhaust the world. Considered more precisely, the world picture is not an image, imagining, or a copy. That is not a correspondence or mimesis of the way things are out there in reality. But it is the mode in which all things appear, such that a particular historical people gets the picture. Whenever we have the world picture, an essential decision takes place regarding what is in its entirety. So the world picture is a decision, coming to fruition of the very temporality through which peoples act upon the world. And of course, our world picture is always representational, a Vorstellung. The medievals saw everything as an ens creatum, created being, by a personal creator god as the highest cause, and everything else as a rank along the great chain of being. The Greeks, in contrast, saw the being of all things as potentially manifesting from hiddenness into presencing, and considered their greatness and salvation a manner of corresponding to the play of primordial appearances. that is, to fathom the ways of nature or physis, and its truth or aletheia. In contrast to both the medieval and the Greek picture, the moderns see all things as objective phenomena to be correctly represented and produced. In all of scientific theory, culture, aesthetics, and religion, the moderns have put themselves as subjects into the world as dominant, thus have invented the very idea of the modern world picture or worldview as well. According to Heidegger, neither the Greeks nor the medievals, strictly speaking, had a world picture, and they only appear to have one anachronistically in modernity's invention of the world picture. There were, to be sure, doctrinal tendencies in the ancient schools of Greek philosophy, such as the Stoic or Epicurean doctrines regarding all things within the world and human beings. But in these cases, as in the earlier parts of the medieval world, the world picture was something to be strived towards in an ideal way of life, not something to be presupposed from the outset. The world picture was, in these beginnings of metaphysics, discovered, but not yet representing and producing all beings, according to a schema or a theory. And finally, the modern world, having established the world picture in Cartesian science and the subsequent history of philosophy through Kant, begins to come unraveled in Nietzsche's view, that is, in his very proclamation of the death of God, the unraveling of our highest values, and the onset of nihilism, which is not in Nietzsche a kind of Weltanschauung or worldview, occurring at some place and time or another, but is the basic character of what happens in Western history. The consequences for existential thinking in Heidegger are pretty immense. Locked in the age of the world picture, we completely forget being, cease to have an original or authentic existential relation to our being in the world. In this way, according to Heidegger, modernity has literally entered a new age, where instead of simply experiencing being and life within tradition and its development, we have invented an infinite diversity of worldviews, all diversely rooted in our subjectivity as arbiters of what is and what matters. I.e., the modern world picture admits readily of the diversity of worldviews and can do so precisely because of its doctrine of subjectivity as the arbiter. And this results in a proliferation of ungrounded isms which characterize our age, including, ironically, existentialism, which is, in part for Heidegger, a humanist world picture in reaction to the forces of science, aesthetics, and technology. The most pernicious feature of the modern world picture is that most everything gets reduced to a calculative or moral aesthetic anthropology, i.e., rooted in subjectivity in the individual as it is. The most difficult thing for the modern world picture to dismantle is its anthropocentrism. The fundamental event of the modern age is indeed the conquest of the world as picture for the human subject. And thus, as a consequence, if we want to think being and Dasein anew, we must think in a post-human way. Indeed, from the historicality of being, however, egged on by our subjective representing and trafficking in world pictures and their orienting axioms in metaphysics, modern subjects are increasingly given over to the gigantic forces of modern technology. Heidegger is writing this, remember, already in 1938. The most dangerous aspect of the modern world picture is its capacity for the total mobilization of all economic resources, a kind of frenzied giganticism of production leading to the massive ordering of human life. Heidegger's hope and conclusion here, as in the memorial address, is learning to be, or to let be. Importantly, Heidegger is not a Luddite here. He sees the shadows of modernity as also providing us moderns with our historical uniqueness, even when we don't inquire into it or know it. But man will never be able to experience and ponder this that is denied so long as he dawdles about in the mere negating of the age. The flight into tradition, out of the combination of humility and presumption, can bring nothing in itself other than self-deception and blindness in relation to our historical moment. Man will know, carefully safeguard into its truth that which is incalculable only in creative questioning and the shaping power of genuine reflection. Reflection, or mindfulness, Besinnung, transports the man of the future into that between in which he belongs to being and yet remains a stranger amidst that which is. And so Heidegger concludes this talk with a poem of Friedrich Hölderlin that is a bit somber and pessimistic. But remember, the year is 1938. Do we, in our own age, have any reason to be less pessimistic? Considering the rapid transformation of the world through the global ordering of information in the internet, and above all, the ecological and planetary crises and catastrophes that have already happened and that now loom. Here we can conclude here with the extent to which Heidegger is a pessimist. Pessimism negates the existing world, yet its negating is ambiguous. It can simply will decay and nothingness, but it can also renounce what exists and thus open a path for a new formation of the world. I hope we've seen how Heidegger, in the Concept of Time essay, in Division 2 of Being in Time, in his thoughts on what philosophy is, always has been and always will be, and on what our contemporary world picture is and how it might be overcome, imply at all levels a certain skepticism or deconstructive method rooted in a hopeful kind of pessimism, which invites us to open a path for a new formation of the world. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and we'll see you next week when we dive more deeply into Heidegger's views on nature, poetry, religion, the futural ones, and the last God. See you then.
Life at the bottom of the ocean.